What we're talking about are source rocks that still retain some of that original oil, but those source rocks are dense and tight and don't want to give up that resource. And that's why geologists who have known about these rocks for a long time have avoided them. But now that all the conventional oil is pretty much spoken for, these are the last worst prospects available. So the oil or gas doesn't want to flow. How do you get it out? By horizontal drilling to increase the contact between the well bore and the fuel-bearing layer, and then hydrofracturing, punching holes with explosives in the well casing, and then pumping in water and chemicals to fracture the rock or to increase the size of the naturally occurring fractures so that the oil or gas can flow into the wellbore. Okay, well, the oil or gas that's close to that wellbore flows in once you've opened up those fractures, but the rest of the rock still doesn't want to give up its oil or gas, so there's a sudden or a rapid release of the oil or gas into the wellbore, and that very quickly declines. So what's the implication of these steep decline rates? It means that the companies have to drill and drill and drill. As each well is drilled, produces, then starts to decline, it's necessary to drill a next well and a next well in order to maintain production rates. So here, for example, we see the number of wells, that's number of U.S. natural gas wells that are operating, has increased by 90% since 1990. But the productivity of each well has declined by almost 40%. Again, this is indication of declining returns on effort. The city of Fort Worth, Texas, again, where the Barnett Shale is focused, received $50 million in revenues from only 44 shale gas wells in 2008. Okay, well, the industry was just getting started in the Barnett and in the Fort Worth area at that time. By 2012, there were almost 400 wells that had been drilled and were producing, but the city only received $23 million in 2012, less than half as much in revenue. Why? Because the sweet spots, the core area had been drilled out. The industry was already starting to move to peripheral areas, lower initial production rates, declining production from existing wells. This is a short-term bubble. The expectation, the claim that this is a long-term trend, the shale revolution that will last 100 years or 200 years, that claim is not confirmed by the data. A couple of years ago, the New York Times published a story based on documents from the industry that Times reporters had recovered, suggesting that the industry itself is skeptical of the longevity and profitability of shale gas. But still, we hear the hype. It seems never-ending. 100 years of shale gas, cheap natural gas. Where are these claims coming from? Well, a large part of it has to do with the business model of the shale gas industry. That business model is based not so much on actual production as on value of assets. Well, what does this mean? Well, actual production of shale gas in many cases is not profitable. Chesapeake Energy, which is the foremost U.S. producer of shale gas, has not actually made money on a net basis on production in any of the last 10 years. And yet, Chesapeake continues to be a profitable company. How can this be? Well, where are their profits coming from? Largely from sales of drilling leases. What's that about? Well, very early on in this whole process, the companies, and again, they tend to be smaller, risk-driven, highly leveraged companies, of which there are dozens, went out throughout these areas, the shale gas and tight oil plays, and leased as much land as they possibly could, millions of acres. And then once they had leased the land, they began talking up the value of these leases, saying that, making all the claims that I just repeated to you, that this was a bonanza that would last for decades, that it was a manufacturing operation. You could sink a drill bit anywhere and come up flush. So as the value of the leases increased, then the operators, the companies, were able to sell the leases to larger oil companies, oil and gas companies like Shell, or to foreign operators in places like China, and make an immense profit on lease sales. And that's what many of these operators have been subsisting on for the last several years. They overproduced shale gas over the short term. And why did they do that? Again, to drive up the value of the lease sales, to underscore the perception of abundance. They also did it because the leases contained clauses, as all drilling leases do, pertaining to the deadlines for drilling. If you don't drill within a certain amount of time, the lease becomes null and void. So there are economic reasons for skepticism about shale gas and tight oil. But there are also, of course, environmental reasons. People who live near fracking operations can testify to the bad air, often causing headaches, respiratory problems, nosebleeds, problems with water quality, and these are now being documented increasingly. It's been difficult up to this time to document many of these environmental and health problems. Why? Because the practice of the industry is to swoop in as quickly as possible once problems become apparent and make a settlement with the people, the property owners who are being affected, who are being impacted. And the settlement, which typically includes payment of money, also typically includes a non-disclosure agreement. So that if you want the money, you can't talk about what happened to you. So this makes it very difficult to compile statistics on environmental problems and health problems. But the statistics are emerging in any case. Often the industry claims that there are enormous economic benefits to be reaped by communities from the advent of fracking. And certainly the subsurface mineral rights ownership regime in the United States has, to a very large extent, supported the fracking industry. The U.S. is almost unique in the world in that property owners also own subsurface mineral rights. Okay, so the companies have to purchase drilling rights from property owners. And so this involves an immediate payment and also a royalty as the oil or gas is actually produced. It's not the same in other parts of the world. Their government owns the subsurface rights. But in the U.S., property owners benefit. Okay, so often communities are divided by fracking from on one side those who stand to benefit financially, and on the other side those who are concerned about the environmental and health problems. And so fracking very often tears communities apart. Meanwhile, the promises of tax revenues and jobs, the evidence suggests that these have been wildly overblown. Many of the jobs that are, the high-paying jobs that are created actually don't go to people within the community. Specialists fly in, do the frack jobs, and then fly back home to Oklahoma or wherever they're from. The short-term jobs that are created within the communities in service industries actually are also associated with the driving up of costs within those communities. The price of real estate and hotel rooms and services increases, so people on fixed incomes within these boom towns suddenly find themselves unable to afford to live in their old town. But it's also very short term. It's a boom town syndrome. Over the short term, lots of jobs in hamburger joints and jobs for pole dancers and all the rest, because of course these are very largely man camps that are set up. Gambling, crime increase, and so on. And then the resource starts to give out, the companies pick up and move away, and the local economy is left to wither. What about the tax revenues? Well, yes, there are tax revenues from production that go to local governments and state governments, but in most cases, and there are studies to document this, in most cases, the tax revenues are not sufficient to offset costs, increased costs, for example, from road damage. It often takes up to 2,000 truck trips to bring in drilling equipment, water, chemicals, and so on, and then take all these things away at the end of the operation for each well. So that's a lot of wear and tear for local roads, because we're talking about thousands and thousands of wells, individual wells. Each well, a couple of thousand truck trips. Well, what does that actually cost? Well, it turns out that very often it costs more in terms of road damage than governments make from tax revenues. Well, the natural gas industry now is talking up the prospect of LNG exports from North America, both from the US and from Canada. Of course, this has local significance because British Columbia is now planning on exporting LNG. Well, is this a good idea? Where it's coming from, of course, is the fact that natural gas in North America is so cheap that producers are losing money on every BTU they produce. Not in every case. There are certainly still profitable wells, but increasingly in the shale gas fields, as operators are being forced to the periphery, they can't make money with natural gas at $3 or $4 per million BTUs. So if they can export that natural gas as LNG to Japan or other countries for $10 or $12 a million BTUs, then there's hope of profitability. But then what happens to all of the promises that the industry has made to the chemicals industry and to the power generation industry and so on of cheap natural gas? See, one of the payoffs to society from fracking for natural gas was supposed to be that we would have this cheap source of fuel.